Who are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello, and welcome to this special edition of the Way to Wow show. I'm your host, Kevin Bemel, and I'm here, well, on special editions, I'm only here when there's a holiday. And this is actually the, I think it's the 1 year anniversary of me doing these. And they started on Independence Day last year, because I had a tradition. I have had, I don't know, what do you call it? I guess it's past when you're anyway. I have a tradition of reading the Declaration of Independence Day every July 4th, and so there was no one with whom to read it last year, so I decided to do a show, and then I've continued kind of through the calendar of doing these shows. So here we are back again on Independence Day, July. As hopefully you know, the United States, or the what were called at the time the United Colonies, declared their independence on July 4th, 1776. They declared their independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain, and they published the Declaration of Independence, which explained to the world why they were taking this heretofore, this is redundant, why they were taking this unprecedented step. So we hear this word unprecedented quite often now, and really what it means is egregious, because somebody's saying this is unprecedented, they can't do this, that kind of thing. That's not what unprecedented means. Unprecedented means there is no precedent, there is nothing. This type of event had never preceded, was not preceded by a similar event. No nation or no group of people had declared themselves independent from their mother country, and so the United States was the first. And because they knew it was an unprecedented action, they decided to publish a document explaining why they were doing this thing. So as I always do on these shows, I talk a little bit about the background of the day, and why we're celebrating, what led to the celebration. And let's see, I realized I've had the wrong title crawl up here. One second. Oops. And I'm not going to be able to spell. There you go. Okay, and okay, there we go. Sorry. So now we have the right title crawl. So last year I talked about the events leading up to the Declaration of Independence. And this year I'm going to talk about the impediments and the incentives for seeking independence. So there's over the last, I would say, 10, 20 years, there seems to have been this sort of, frankly, ahistoric take that's come to the fore on why the colonies declared independence. And so I'm going to take the opportunity to talk about what was going on at that time that served as, like I said, impediments or incentives to take this step that was never taken before. So on the impediments side of the ledger, first of all, many of the colonists wanted to retain their loyalty to king and country, the country being Great Britain. So they identified as British subjects. Okay, now we in the United States, we call ourselves citizens, and typically in a republic, which is what the United States is, we are citizens of the republic. But in a monarchy, one is a subject because one is subject to, okay, the authority of the monarch, the king or the queen, typically, right? But beyond that, many of the colonists believe that King George III of Great Britain had their best interests at heart. So they disagreed with ideas like King George III is a tyrant, which is what John Adams and Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin, among other delegates to the convention, thought, the Continental Congress, I should say. Um, they thought King George III was a tyrant. They believed they had the proof. It actually is enumerated in the Declaration that we'll read in a little while. But others disagreed with that quite vehemently, and so that was this disagreement was an impediment. As well, the idea of a monarchy, was deeply ingrained in European political culture. Most people had never known any other type of government. In fact, none really had ever known any other type of government. Now, there was a democracy in ancient Greece, but of course, nobody from ancient Greece was still alive in the late 1700s. So it was just, from many people's standpoint, a monarchy was the natural order of things, and so it made no sense to change it. It just wasn't in their worldview to think it should be otherwise. And even among some of the revolutionaries, they felt like they ought to address their grievances while remaining part of the British Empire, and hence why the Olive Branch Petition was made in 1775, which pledged loyalty to the king and asked for peace. This was after the battles of Lexington and Concord and Bunker and Bunker and Breed Hills, and so, like we see today, even members of the same party often have very different views from each other. So these weren't monolithic camps. The revolutionaries and the anti-revolutionaries, or what were probably at the time better known as the Tories, right? So loyalty to king and country was an impediment to the United States becoming an independent nation. Another impediment was fear of military retaliation. So, Great Britain's military was arguably the strongest in the world. Certainly, the Royal Navy dominated the seas. Now, France had a strong land army. Its army may have been stronger than Great Britain's, but its navy was not. The French had a strong navy, but not as strong as Great Britain. Germany also had a strong army, but and it might have been its army might have been stronger than Great Britain's, but its navy was nowhere near anything like the navy that Great Britain had. Great Britain basically had a worldwide empire by this time, and it needed a strong navy in order to sustain that empire. And so much of Great Britain's wealth went to supporting that navy, which most Britons agreed was a good thing, because the commerce and the material prosperity that came from Great Britain's empire was to the benefit of a large proportion of the British population. So the British military was also well seasoned. It had fought and essentially won the 7 Years' War, known in the colonial America as the French and Indian War. It had overcome rebellions in Ireland and Scotland, and so the colonists knew they were lightly armed, they were poorly organized, they lacked international allies, and so from a pure military standpoint, the colonies were not a match for Great Britain. Hence the brilliance of George Washington, who crafted a military strategy that allowed the United States to prevail. So if you saw my show for George Washington's birthday back in February, I talked about that a little bit. So again, the military disparity and the fear of military retaliation was an impediment to independence. Another was the colonies' economic dependence on Great Britain. So the way the colonial system worked was essentially the colonies produced raw materials that were then sent to the mother country where they were manufactured into products. So cotton would be grown primarily in the South. That cotton would be sent to Great Britain, where it would be milled into cloth, and then the cloth would be sewn into clothing. So there was not a lot of manufacturing in the colonies. Certainly in the South, there was virtually none, right? The South was producing um, products like cotton, indigo, tobacco, but much of the manufacturing process happened in Great Britain. And so there was some people would call it a symbiotic relationship, a mutually beneficial relationship in terms of economic growth. Others would have called it a parasitic relationship. The revolutionaries felt it was parasitic because, in essence, Great Britain prohibited much of manufacturing capacity in the colonies in order to sustain what amounted to a monopoly in Great Britain itself. They didn't want the colonies to be competing with them in terms of manufacture. So that was a problem. And then revolution would have disrupted other forms of trade between Great Britain and the colonies, thereby having a very bad impact on shipping. And ports like Boston, New York, Charleston, that owed their prosperity primarily to shipping, were concerned that they would see an economic collapse as a result of independence. So economic dependency was a third impediment to declaring independence. The fourth was a lack of unity among the colonies. So the colonies differed in religion, in economy, in how they were settled. And so, for example, Massachusetts was dominated by Puritan Congregationalists. Pennsylvania was primarily a Quaker colony, and it also had a large German population, German immigrant population. The South was dominated by Anglicans, who were, for the most part, planters. And as I mentioned just a couple of minutes ago, the South was largely agrarian. So they produced, as I mentioned a minute ago, cotton, tobacco, rice was another crop that was produced in the South, indigo. So the South had an agrarian economy. The North had a more tradesman oriented economy. So Paul Revere, for example, he was a silversmith and a coppersmith, and there were lots of tradesmen like Paul Revere in the North, and so their economy was based much more on trade and crafts type manufacturing than the South's was. And so how independence would impact them and how lack of independence would impact them differed north and south, and even in the middle colonies. So because of these different interests, it made the concept of becoming an independent nation more difficult. So and as well, the one region oftentimes didn't have a whole lot of sympathy for the grievances of another. So the southern colonies in general, they weren't particularly open to hearing about the grievances of Massachusetts and Boston, where the British were blockading the harbor. They were attempting to strangle trade because of what they saw as the active rebelliousness of Boston and larger Massachusetts. And many Southerners thought that, well, look, this is what you get for conducting the activities like the Tea Party and other forms of rebellion. So, just because the British are punishing you doesn't mean that we should declare independence from the mother country, especially when our whole economy is dependent on trade with the mother country. As well, the South at this time in the late 1700s, much of the labor that went on in the South was done by slaves, and so they and in the North there was already an active anti-slavery movement. Benjamin Franklin had already started the first anti-slavery organization in the colonies. The movement was gaining more and more popularity in the North and in the middle colonies, and in fact, even among Southerners, the maintenance of slavery was they were kind of losing their stomach for it. So, and people accuse, for example, Thomas Jefferson and George Washington, among others, of being hypocritical because Thomas Jefferson was anti-slavery while at the same time he owned slaves, and he found it very difficult to essentially destroy his livelihood for his beliefs. So, look, I mean, I don't, one need not commend him for that decision, but one need not condemn him either. It was a very difficult situation in which he found himself, and he just wasn't sure what to do. In the end, he freed his slaves when he died. George Washington did something similar. Both men thought that slavery needed to be essentially phased out. They on the one hand couldn't see that it would be ended, a week from today kind of thing, because it would have destroyed the economy of the South. On the other hand, they didn't want to see it perpetuated. And that's why when Thomas Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, he condemned slavery and essentially called in it for, he essentially put a call in it for the eradication of slavery in America. That particular clause did not survive debate on the Declaration of Independence. The South was solid in essentially saying, if you keep that phrase or that part of the Declaration of Independence in the document, we will not vote for independence. And because I believe it was 3/4 of the colonies needed to ratify the Declaration of Independence, the American colonies as a group could not have declared independence without at least one or perhaps two of the southern colonies. And for the northern and middle states to have declared independence without the South, almost for sure. a war which most people knew they would have to fight with Great Britain if independence were declared. That war would have been lost without the South. The South was, well, first of all, George Washington was a Southerner, and a lot of the best officers came from the South, as did a lot of the manpower. So it was just not possible to declare independence without the South on board. So on the other hand, in colonies like New York and New Jersey, and even in the Carolinas, there were large groups of loyalists called Tories, as I mentioned before, and they were ideologically committed to staying loyal to King George III and Great Britain. And, George Washington remarked that New York and Manhattan in general was a hotbed of essentially Tories attempting to undermine the fight for independence. In fact, when Great Britain lost the war for independence, many of the Tories left America because they were afraid that retribution would be taken on them, and so they left rather than staying in the now established free United States of America. And then finally, the final impediment to independence was there was an absence of a clear alternative government. So while there were many who disliked British rule, they like, what was going to be the alternative? And they were afraid that the colonies would descend into anarchy and some demagogue might take over, and they would be worse off than they were under King George III. So before the Declaration of Independence and the continental the colonies operated under what was known as the Articles of Confederation. It was a loose grouping of the colonies. There was no real central government like we know today, and like what was established by the U.S. Constitution. And so there was little ability to legally enforce the Articles of Confederation, so they were just very unclear what is going to happen from a governance sense if we declare and become independent from Great Britain. So the idea of Republican government, small r Republican government, a republic, this was not a tested idea. It was there were not republics, in Europe for all intents and purposes. And so while people, especially people who were well learned, understood it at least intellectually, in actual practice, they were concerned that it might start as a republic or intend to be a republic, but it could fall into tyranny. And again, that tyranny could be worse than what the colonies were dealing with under King George, or it could lead to a tyranny of the majority. So for example, Baptists were a minority religion back then, and they were afraid of what the majority might do with respect to their religious rights. Roman Catholics had a similar fear. And so, again, because there was no clear sense of what a government in an independent America would be, there were many people who were at best indifferent about independence, and in many cases, they were opposed to it. So all of those were impediments to independence. Now, there were many incentives for declaring independence and becoming an independent country. One of the best known was the colonists felt that they were being taxed without having representation. So the colonists had no seats in the British Parliament, yet they were being taxed. So on the one hand, they were Englishmen, evidently, But they, as unlike their peers in Great Britain, they did not have representation in the British Parliament. And so when it came to the Stamp Act, for example, in 1765, that required printed materials such as newspapers and legal documents and playing cards to carry a tax stamp that had to be bought and paid for in British currency, and the Townshend Acts, which imposed duties on goods like glass and lead and paint and paper and tea. So, and the revenue from the Townshend Act was used to pay the royal officials like the tax collectors and the governors. So it reduced the control that the colonials had over these British officials. So that this taxation was going on, this reduction of control of their daily lives was going on, and at the same time they had no representation in the British Parliament, smacked of tyranny to many of the colonists who became revolutionaries. So that was one incentive for declaring independence. The second was economic restrictions that the mother country put on the colonies. So the Navigation Acts, which started in the 1650s, they restricted colonial trade to being carried by British ships, and they required that all goods be shipped through Britain first. So for example, Georgia, which was a cotton-producing state, Georgia could not ship cotton on French ships directly to France. That the Navigation Acts did not allow that. And the reason Britain did that was because it prevented competition and therefore essentially allowed the British to set the price for the goods that they bought from the colonies. And so this economic restriction really put limits on not just the free trade, but also on the profits and wealth that the colonists could aspire to. As well, there were what were known as writs of assistance. These were general search warrants that allowed British officials to search homes and businesses for smuggled goods without any specific cause. So, today, in order to get a search warrant, a law enforcement agency has to go to a judge and demonstrate cause for getting the authority to search a particular residence or business. Under a writ of assistance, the official did not need to have any cause whatever. They could go in and just go on what amounted to a fishing expedition, as we call them today. And so this was seen by many colonists as an abuse of power. And then finally, many merchants and consumers thought that independence would allow for free trade and therefore greater prosperity. So the economic restrictions that Great Britain put on the colonies, which, by the way, the British, these were not placed only on the American colonies. All British colonies had these restrictions. It's just that the colonists felt them more keenly and realized that they could achieve greater prosperity without them. And so the fact that Great Britain maintained these restrictions and was absolutely they were just absolutely committed to maintaining them. They showed no indication that they would lighten them up. So this gave the colonists an incentive to declare independence. Also, so the first two are kind of practical considerations, but Enlightenment ideas were bubbling up at this time, starting in the mid to late 1700s. Among the best known Enlightenment philosophers was John Locke, who argued that people had what he called natural rights to life, liberty, and property. And indeed, in the original Declaration of Independence, Jefferson said that among these rights are life, liberty, and property. Property was changed to the pursuit of happiness, but the pursuit of happiness was was generally thought to be sort of economic prosperity. That's how happiness was meant in that context. So Locke also propounded the philosophy that government should only exist with the consent of the governed. Okay, so therefore people had the right to overthrow a tyrannical ruler. And this idea these ideas in general heavily influenced people such as Thomas Jefferson, Benjamin Franklin, and James Otis, three of the most ardent revolutionaries. But it's why they felt that they had the right to declare independence from King George III. They declared him a tyrant, and that he no longer had the consent of the governed, i.e., the colonists, and so they had the right to declare independence, and there was nothing the king could do about that. Now, of course, not everybody in the colonies held by Enlightenment ideas. Certainly, the Loyalists, the Tories, did not. But these ideas were discussed broadly, and many people who may not have been literate enough to understand Locke's writings themselves, and or may not have been able to afford his books, still these ideas permeated through society in the colonies, and they were broadly discussed. Okay. Next, going back to a more pragmatic incentive, British military action. So this is what I discussed last year. I talked about various precipitating events that led up to the Declaration of Independence. One in 1770, in which British soldiers killed 5 civilians in what was called the Boston Massacre. It was widely propagandized at the time. And interestingly enough, John Adams defended the British soldiers in a trial in which, if they had been convicted, they could have been sentenced to death. Adams, although a committed revolutionary himself, was equally committed to justice, and so that's why he took on that case. In 1775, the British attempted to seize colonial weapons stored in Concord, Massachusetts, leading to the battles of Lexington and Concord. This was the first open armed conflict in what became the American Revolution. British burned towns like Falmouth, Maine, and Norfolk, Virginia. This further inflamed public opinion. And finally, the British Army hired Hessian, i.e., German mercenaries, okay, to fight for them in the colonies. And this caused a great deal of not just resentment, but fear that because these Hessians were not Englishmen like themselves, that they would fight with barbarity, and there would be foreign interference and even greater oppression, than they were experiencing currently, if they remained within the British Empire. So British military actions were also an issue. So. And then along came, in January 1776, the publication by Thomas Paine of a small book, really a pamphlet, called Common Sense. And it used plain language to argue for independence. Paine attacked the monarchy as being absurd. He's saying it was unnatural for a small island ruled by a king to rule over a vast continent. The Common Sense sold over 100,000 copies within months. This was a huge number, okay, given the population of the colonies at the time, and also given literacy rates. So just to give you an idea, while in New England, white men had a literacy rate of about 85 to 90%, and in the middle colonies 60 to 70%, and in the South 50 to 60%. And white women had a literacy rate of 45 to 65% in New England, and maybe 30 to 40% in the South. Slaves had literacy rates of less than 10% because it was illegal to teach them to read. And even free blacks probably didn't have a literacy rate much higher than that. Now, contrast that today, where the literacy rate among white Americans is probably above 95%, maybe as high as 99%. Among Black Americans, probably 85 to 95%. Among Latino Americans, probably between 80 and 90%. Okay, and so, the literacy rates were significantly lower then than they were today, and despite that, there was massive sales of common sense, and it allowed the average person to understand philosophically the underpinnings of the calls for independence by the revolutionaries. So then, two more two more incentives for declaring independence. One is the many of the colonists saw that reconciliation was just not going to happen. So they had submitted many petitions and appeals to the Parliament and to the King, most notably the one I mentioned earlier, the Olive Branch petition, seeking compromise. All were rejected, in fact, summarily rejected. And then punitive laws like the Prohibitionary Act of 1775, which declared the colonies in rebellion and cut off trade, became the result. And so the colonists were, I think, rightly incensed that even as they were trying to reach a compromise, the Parliament and the King were intractable. Now, to be accurate, there were many in the British Parliament. There were many MPs, ministers of Parliament, who were in favor of compromising with the colonists. There were some who supported American independence. Okay, so just like in America, opinion was not monolithic, nor was that in the case in Great Britain, even among the ruling class. Okay, so it was just that there was enough, or I should say, there was not enough support among the compromisers and those in favor of independence in Parliament for them to carry the day, and so many of the colonists ended up concluding that Great Britain was just, they were not interested in reconciliation or moderate rule, the kind of rule that they exercised in the mother country. They were absolutely committed to domination, and so there was no other choice but to declare independence. And finally, there was the opportunity to start and build a new nation. And this was a big incentive, especially for people like Thomas Jefferson and James Otis, who were very knowledgeable about Enlightenment principles and were eager to found a country with those principles as their basis, free from aristocracy, free from what they felt was the corruption that is endemic to aristocracies. And so they really had this idea of creating an idyllic country where every man was free, every person was free. And it's why they were opposed to slavery. And now Thomas Jefferson had more of a sort of an agrarian idyllic country in mind. Others felt that the country's economy would be more broadly based, but what they also saw was that a country based on Enlightenment principles would have a level of social, a potential for social and economic mobility that just was not present in Great Britain at this time. And in fact, um, uh, it would take another century before some of the social structures in Great Britain moderated enough to where there was really any kind of meaningful social and economic mobility among a majority of the British population. Now, there was some economic mobility in Great Britain, even in the 18th century, but nothing like what what America offered after independence. And other groups, or some groups, I should say, like farmers and frontiersmen. So they thought that independence would give them an opportunity to gain land and have some power about over how the country was governed, whereas such people in Great Britain would not had no hope of gaining power, certainly not in their lifetimes. So all of these were incentives that were discussed, debated, and finally led to the decision by the Continental Congress to declare independence and then to write the Declaration of Independence and publish it, which occurred essentially on July 4th. So I'm going to now read the Declaration of Independence, as has been my practice for many years now. I think it's incumbent upon us to read this document once a year so we can understand the underpinnings of our country. The Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution together really tell us what the United States of America is all about. So, Declaration of Independence. In Congress, July 4th, 1776, the unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind require that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. That whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it and to institute new government, laying its foundation on such principles and organizing its powers in such form as to them shall seem most likely to affect their safety and happiness. Prudence, indeed, will dictate that governments long established should not be changed for light or transient causes. And accordingly, all experience hath shown that mankind are more disposed to suffer while evils are sufferable than to right themselves by abolishing the forms to which they are accustomed. But when a long train of abuses and usurpations, pursuing invariably the same object, evinces a design to reduce them under absolute despotism, it is their right, it is their duty to throw off such government and to provide new guards for their future security. Such has been the patient sufferance of these colonies, and such is now the necessity which constrains them to alter their former systems of government. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. He has refused his assent to laws the most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He has forbidden his governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation till his assent should be obtained. And when so suspended, he has utterly neglected to attend to them. He has refused to pass other laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, unless those people should relinquish the right of representation in the legislature, a right inestimable to them and formidable to tyrants only. He has called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the sole purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He has dissolved representative houses repeatedly for opposing with manly firmness his invasions on the rights of the people. He has refused for a long time, under such dissolutions, to cause others to be elected, whereby the legislative powers, incapable of annihilation, have returned to the people at large for their exercise. The state remaining in the meantime exposed to all the dangers of invasion from without and convulsions from within. He has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose endeavored to prevent the population of these states. For that purpose, obstructing the laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. He has obstructed the administration of justice by refusing his assent to laws for establishing judiciary powers. He has made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices and the amount and payment of their salaries. He has erected a multitude of new offices and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. He has kept among us, in times of peace, standing armies without the consent of our legislatures. He has affected to render the military independent of and superior to the civil power. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation, for quartering large bodies of armed troops among us, for protecting them by a mock trial from punishment for any murders which they should commit on the inhabitants of these states, for cutting off our trade with all parts of the world, for imposing taxes on us without our consent, for depriving us in many cases of the benefits of trial by jury, for transporting us beyond seas to be tried for pretended offenses, for abolishing the free system of English laws in a neighboring province, establishing therein an arbitrary government and enlarging its boundaries so as to render it at once an example and fit instrument for introducing the same absolute rule into these colonies, for taking away our charters, abolishing our most valuable laws, and altering fundamentally the forms of our government, for suspending our own legislatures and declaring themselves invested with power to legislate for us in all cases whatsoever. He has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. He has plundered our seas, ravaged our coasts, burnt our towns, and destroyed the lives of our people. He is at this time transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries to complete the works of death, desolation, and tyranny, already begun with circumstances of cruelty and perfidy scarcely paralleled in the most barbarous ages and totally unworthy the head of a civilized nation. He has constrained our fellow citizens, taken captive on the high seas, to bear arms against their country, to become the executioners of their friends and brethren, or to fall themselves by their hands. He has excited domestic insurrections among us, and has endeavored to bring on the inhabitants of our frontiers the merciless Indian savages, whose known rule of warfare is indistinguished destruction of all ages, sexes, and conditions. In every stage of the oppressions, we have petitioned for redress, and in most humble terms. Our repeated petitions have been answered only by repeated injury. A prince whose character is thus marked by every act which may define a tyrant is unfit to be the ruler of a free people. Nor have we been wanting in attention to our British brethren. We have warned them from time to time of attempts by their legislature to extend an unwarrantable jurisdiction over us. We have reminded them of the circumstances of our immigration and settlement here. We have appealed to their native justice and magnanimity, and we have conjured them by the ties of our common kindred to disavow these usurpations, which would inevitably interrupt our connections and correspondence. They too have been deaf to the voice of justice and of consanguinity. We must, therefore, acquiesce in the necessity which denounces our separation and hold them as we hold the rest of mankind. Enemies in war, in peace, friends. We, therefore, the representatives of the United States of America, in General Congress, assembled, appealing to the Supreme Judge of the world for the rectitude of our intentions, do, in the name and by the authority of the good people of these colonies, solemnly publish and declare that these united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states, that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown, and that all political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is and ought to be totally dissolved, and that as free and independent states, they have full power to levy war, conclude peace, contract alliances, establish commerce, and to do all other acts and things which independent states may of right do. And for support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. Especially the last part of the Declaration where independence is actually declared. It never fails to move me, despite having read it numerous times. I think there's a couple of things I'd like to point out in closing. One is, throughout the Declaration of Independence, we see the founders of our country calling on God to guide them and protect them, to make this experiment in Republican government successful. The language that Thomas Jefferson wrote calls us to a high sense of ideals. And so this Independence Day, I'll leave you with these two thoughts, or these few thoughts. Number one, if you're not already flying your flag, I hope you will. I hope you'll fly it with pride for our country that is still to live up to its ideals. Number two, I hope you'll hear in your soul the inspiring words of Thomas Jefferson and allow them to guide what you say and do today, so that we can celebrate Independence Day as Americans united, not Americans divided. And finally, I hope you'll take a moment to contemplate how God has truly blessed this country. It was not a sure thing that the Declaration of Independence would see its purpose fulfilled in a war that began in 1775 and lasted until 1883. It was not a foregone conclusion that the framers at the Constitutional Convention would write a document that has served this country well for over 2 centuries. We are blessed, and if we remember it no other day of the year, hopefully we'll remember it today. So I thank you very much for joining me on this special edition of the Way to Wow shows. I wish you and your family, your loved ones, your friends, all the people you'll be gathering with today, a meaningful and an outstandingly enjoyable 4th of July. Thank you so much for watching.